Welcome. This video focuses on reading and writing files and managing that process from within Qt Creator. So I'm going to assume that you've already read the basics of how to read and write files. I'm not going to describe that part. So I've got just some basic code to write a file, to open a file called output.txt, and to write hello world to it. The good news is it's a very simple process. Basically it's just like reading or writing from the console, so if you know how to do that, doing it to a file is not much harder. The only tricky thing is figuring out where the heck this file is going to end up. So I build this program and I run it, and I don't see anything because I'm not printing to the console. I'm printing to this file called output.txt. Well, to figure out where that is, I can go to the projects mode, and here's where I can configure the build process, which I don't want to mess with, and I can also look at what happens when I run the program. So if I go to the Run tab, what I see is that when this is run, we are running out of the working directory C users Andrew desktop files. This is the directory where the program is running. So here's that folder right on my desktop. If I pop it open, this is where the project file is. It's where my source code is. It's not where the actual executable is built in that debug folder, but this is the directory the program is running out of. So anything I create, like output.txt, there's the hello world, is going to be located in this directory. Now you can change that. Basically you should never mess with it unless you've got some special reason to. If you've got a file you want to read, just put it in that directory. And Qt Creator will find it. If you are creating a file, it'll end up there. So let's go back to the code. Now that we know where to find files, I can see there's a file called numbers.txt and it has 5 numbers. So we're going to go read that. So I'm going to get rid of the file writing code and uncomment this chunk of code. So we open numbers.txt, we're doing with an input file stream. I've got X and Y, and I'm going to read in those the first 2 numbers in the file and print them out. And I get 15 and 12, and indeed that's what was there. 15 and 12, so that looks good. But if I goof up, let's say I do number.txt, and I build this program and I run it, I get some crazy numbers. This is an important thing to realize, is what happens when you open a file. If something goes bad, it's not like your whole program stops running. What happens is the program tries to open number.txt, it doesn't find it. So if you try and ask it to do input from that file, it just gives up and doesn't do anything. So basically, reading in to X and Y from this file that we couldn't find, I don't get some error message. All that happens is we don't even try to do the read in. So what X and Y have is just whatever initial values they had. And since I didn't initialize them, they have random values. If I go make these have explicit kind of initial values and run this program, you can see we end up with exactly what I put in. Because it couldn't find the file, it basically skipped even trying to do the input. And the same thing happens if you read in some things and then you run out of input. So let's go back to numbers.txt and get this working again. Alright, so we get the first 2 numbers. And let's read in the first 2 numbers, then read in the next 2 and just wipe out X and Y and read in the next 2. So I'll build this and run this. I get 22 and 18. Well, if I go look at the file, the last 2 numbers, 15, 12, 14, and 18. So X is 15, Y is 12, X is 14, Y is 18, X is 22, and there's nothing else to read. So what happens is it tries to read in the Y. There's nothing there to read, so it just gives up and dies silently. And what we have in Y is the 18 that it read in last time, back up here. So at any point, if you've try and read something in and it fails, it's just going to give up and stop trying to take in input. So what you want to make sure you're doing is testing the file to see when it's actually there and when it's not. So I'll try opening the file. If I have a problem, so I'm going to go back to kind of the initial code. If I try to open the file and it fails, then infile.fail will report true. And I can report could not open the file, and I could do something like return 0 to exit out of the program. And that way we don't try to run the program if I've got a bad file name. It tells me could not open the file. If I give it the good file name, then infile.fail will report false, and we'll skip the if, and we'll continue on, and actually read in the first two numbers. Now, say I want to read in all 5 numbers, but I don't necessarily know how many there are in advance. Well, I'm going to need a loop. And I'm going to need a loop that does something like this. So I'm going to uncomment that. And so while we're not at the end of file, we're going to have a number. We need to read into the number and then print it out. So we'll build this and run it. And you can see I got all the numbers, except I get the last number twice, which is kind of odd. Now I can fix that in a very easy, tricky way. I'm editing the text file now, and what I did is I just saved it, and I got rid of the blank line at the end. And now I've got the right list of stuff. What's happened here is that before there was a blank line at the end of the file, so it read in the 22, printed that out, and then we asked, hey, is the file done? No, well, there's some more stuff there, and it's not smart enough to know that there's a blank line there, and that doesn't do us any good. It just knows we're not at the end of the file, so we say, okay, we're going to come back in, we're going to try and read another number. Well, there's no number on that line, so it fails, and we don't update number, and we just end up using that value that happens to be, since we're essentially reusing the same spot in memory, so we've got the value that was there last time. All right. If there's no extra line, then when we read 22 and we ask, hey, are we at the end of the file, it can tell that, yes, there's nothing else there. This is probably not great behavior. So what we really need to do is after we read in the number, if we're at all worried about there possibly being another blank line, is to explicitly test and do something like, well, if we just failed, right, if we tried to read in the number and we failed, then we're going to break. We're going to get out of this loop, and we're not going to process this number printed out. And so this version behaves okay, even if there is that extra line there. All right, we keep going until there's an end of a file. We get our input. We check and make sure that we didn't fail. If we did fail, we break out of there and don't do anything. If we didn't fail, then we go ahead and process the information we just read in. Now, there's a kind of a shorter C++ way of doing this. So rather than have the two separate tests, what you'll often see kind of in the C++ world is this construct. So there's going to be some number. While we successfully read in to number, do something with it. So this says read in from infile into number, and has the side effect of being true if it worked and false if it didn't. So basically this is going to try and read in and be true if it succeeded, and then we'll do what's inside. Otherwise it'll be false and we'll bail out. And so this is just a slightly more succinct, kind of a tricky way of doing it, but a little more succinct, short way of writing what we had before with the two separate tests, this version. Now the one other thing we're going to look at real quick is reading in a bunch of records. So I've got this file, baby names ranking. It's got 10 different records, the top 10 records for boys' names. The number one boy's name in 2010 was Jacob, and the number one girl's name was Isabella. And how many babies, I think this was in thousands, were named that from the U.S. Social Security Department. And then Ethan and Sophia were 2, Michael and Emma were 3, etc. So I want to read in these records. So I've got code to do that. I'm going to bring this in and go kind of look at it. All right, so I need to open the file, check and make sure we didn't fail. And if we didn't fail, then what I want to do is I want to think of this as like one record. So I'm going to say, if we're not at the end of the file, I want to try and just suck in that whole record. And so what I know that there is to read is a boy name, a girl name, the rank, that first number, and I don't care about these two numbers. So I'm going to write this as read in the whole line, rank, the boy name, and then read into trash. So read the actual number for the boys, read that into this variable trash, because I don't care about it. Then read into girl name, so that should grab Isabella, and then read into trash one more time for the last number, the actual number of girls, which once again I don't care about. Check and see if we failed. If we failed, then great, we can break out of here. We don't want to print anything out because I don't want to do the last line twice. Otherwise, we'll print out the current record. So let's build this and run it, and we get just the data that we care about. If I get rid of that test in the middle, can easily end up with this duplicate last line and kind of weird behavior. So as you're doing kind of input from a file, if you're doing something like this, where you're reading in a bunch of records, kind of remember this two-step process. Got one condition, I'm going to keep going until we hit the end of file. So while we're not at the end of the file, keep reading. After we read in all the stuff that we care about from one line, just do a sanity check and make sure we didn't fail before we try and actually do work with that.